I sat in the grand ballroom of the Scottsdale Country Club, my hands trembling slightly around the stem of my water glass. Around me, 200 guests in their finest attire cheered wildly, raising champagne flutes to toast my daughter's husband, Jason Halbrook, the self-proclaimed genius, heir of my late husband's empire. I forced a thin smile and tried to breathe normally, though the tight, designer dress Amelia had insisted I wear made that difficult. "To the visionary who will take Halbrook Industries to unprecedented heights," someone shouted. More applause, more cheers. My son-in-law stood on the elevated stage, bathed in spotlight, beaming beside a gleaming new Tesla, his small reward for the company's success, while a digital screen behind him flashed images of our family. Legacy. The business I had helped David, my late husband, build from nothing into a $75 million empire. Jason raised his glass. "To the future." My children, Amelia and Caleb, stood in the front row, smiling at him like devoted disciples. They'd forgotten entirely that their mother, me, Lillian Brooks, was sitting right here, relegated to a corner table with distant relatives and administrative staff. "Mom, please try to look happier," Amelia had whispered earlier, straightening my pearl necklace with impatient fingers. This is Jason's big night. Everything was Jason's now. The mansion David and I had purchased when it was just a modest home, which we'd expanded room by room as our family and fortune grew. The company we'd built working 16-hour days while raising our children. Even my voice in family decisions had been silenced, dismissed as the ramblings of just an old lady who didn't understand modern business. I was 62, hardly ancient. "And now," Jason announced, his professionally whitened smile gleaming, "I'd like to unveil the future direction of Halbrook Industries." The screens behind him changed to display architectural renderings of a massive development project. I recognized the land immediately, the 30 acres on the outskirts of Scottsdale that David had purchased decades ago, saying, "This will be our legacy to the community someday, Lily. Something that matters." The Halbrook Heights, Jason declared proudly, a luxury residential complex that will transform unused land into the most exclusive address in Arizona. My heart sank. David had wanted that land preserved as a nature education center for underprivileged children. We'd talked about it for years, drafted plans together. It was supposed to be his gift to the community that had embraced us when we were nobodies. From across the room, I caught Caleb's eye. My son, the financial wizard who had once shared his father's values, quickly looked away, unable to hold my gaze. He knew. They all knew what this land had meant to David. I sat perfectly still as Jason outlined his vision of high-end condominiums, exclusive amenities, and limited environmental impact to thunderous applause. Each word felt like a betrayal of everything David had believed in. "And none of this would be possible," Jason continued, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was humility, "without the vision of my late father-in-law, David Brooks, who left this company in my capable hands." I nearly choked on my water. Left the company in his hands? David had never even liked Jason. Their relationship had been cordial at best, strained at worst. My husband had concerns about Jason's ethics, his flashy lifestyle, his obsession with appearances over substance. As if reading my thoughts, Amelia appeared at my table, sliding into the empty chair beside me. At 36, my daughter was stunning in her crimson gown, but the tight lines around her eyes betrayed her stress. "Isn't this wonderful, Mom?" she whispered, squeezing my hand too tightly. "Jason's making Dad's company even more successful." I looked into my daughter's eyes, searching for the passionate, justice-oriented young woman who had once volunteered at homeless shelters and protested corporate greed. Where had that Amelia gone? "Your father wanted that land preserved," I said quietly. Her smile hardened. "Mom, that was years ago. We have to be practical now. The nature center idea was quaint, but this is business." Quaint. The word hung between us like a slap. My decades of business, acumen, the nights I'd spent helping David navigate financial crises, the relationships I'd built with investors, all reduced to quaint ideas from a woman too old to understand progress. "Amelia," I started, but she was already rising, her attention captured by someone more important. "We'll talk later, Mom. Try the salmon. It's divine." She kissed my cheek and was gone, a perfumed whisper in designer heels. The evening dragged on, speeches blending into toasts, blending into self-congratulatory videos about the company's bright future. I sat through it all, invisible yet watching. I'd perfected this role over the years since David's death. The widow who should be grateful for her children's care, who shouldn't question their decisions, who should quietly fade into background. Photographs at family events. As dessert was served, an elaborate chocolate sculpture of the Halbrook Industries logo, I felt a presence beside me. A tall, lean man in a charcoal suit had appeared at my elbow. I didn't recognize him, which was unusual. I knew most of our business associates and friends. "Mrs. Brooks?" he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the celebration. "Yes? My name is Michael Reeves. I'm a notary public." He slid into the empty chair beside me, reaching into his jacket to produce a thick cream-colored envelope. "I've been instructed to deliver this to you personally tonight." The envelope felt heavy in my hands. My name was written across the front in handwriting I would recognize anywhere, David's distinctive slanted script. "Who gave you this?" I whispered, my fingers tracing the letters. "Your husband's attorney, Howard Whitman. He said I should tell you, the truth belongs to her." Those were his exact words. The man's eyes were kind but professional. "I'll need you to sign confirming receipt." Numbly, I signed the form he presented. The envelope seemed to pulse in my hands like a living thing. "Thank you, Mrs. Brooks." He stood, straightening his tie. "If I may, timing matters with that document." Before I could ask what he meant, he had disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone with David's final message, delivered 3 years after his death. On stage, Jason was wrapping up his victory lap. And so, as we move Halbrook Industries into its next chapter, I want to thank everyone who supported me, especially my wife, Amelia, and my brother-in-law, Caleb, for their unwavering faith in my vision. Not a word about me. Not a single acknowledgement of the woman who had helped create everything he now claimed as his achievement. I slipped the envelope into my purse just as Jason raised his glass one final time. "To new beginnings." The crowd echoed him enthusiastically. "To new beginnings." They had no idea how prophetic those words would be. The drive home from the celebration was silent. My son Caleb had insisted on escorting me back to the guest house. Yes, the guest house, on what had once been my own property. 3 years ago, after David's passing, Amelia and Jason had suggested I might be more comfortable in the smaller residence at the edge of the estate. For my safety and convenience, they'd said. What they really meant was that I would be out of their way. "You're quiet, Mom," Caleb observed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. At 34, my son had grown to resemble his father. The same strong jaw, the same analytical gaze. But where David's eyes had held warmth and integrity, Caleb's now reflected calculation. "It was a long evening," I replied, my purse clutched tightly on my lap, David's envelope burning a hole through the leather. "Jason did well, don't you think? Those development plans will triple the company's value." I turned to look out the window at the desert landscape sliding past, illuminated by moonlight. "Your father wanted that land preserved." Caleb's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Dad wasn't always practical about business, Mom. Jason understands the market." "And you agree with him? About erasing your father's wish for a nature center?" He sighed, the sound familiar, the same exasperated exhale he used whenever I questioned the new direction of the company. "It's not about erasing anything. It's about adaptation. The company has to grow." "At what cost?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. As we pulled up to the guest house, a 3,000-square-foot cottage that would be considered a mansion by most standards, Caleb leaned over to kiss my cheek. "Try to get some rest, Mom. You look tired." Translation: "You look old. You look irrelevant. You look like someone who should quietly accept her children's decisions." "Good night, Caleb." I stepped out of his luxury SUV, another company expense that Jason had approved without hesitation. Once inside, I kicked off the uncomfortable heels Amelia had insisted would take 10 years off my appearance and sank into my favorite armchair. The envelope from David weighed in my hands as I stared at it, afraid of what it might contain. The house was quiet except for the soft humming of the air conditioning. I'd made this space my own over the past 3 years, filled it with books, photographs, and memories that my children deemed too old-fashioned for the main house. Here, at least, I could breathe without judgment. I carefully broke the seal on the envelope and extracted several folded documents. On top was a letter, handwritten on David's personal stationery. "My dearest Lillian, if you're reading this, then Howard has determined the time is right. I hope I'm wrong about what I feared might happen after my death, but I've always trusted your judgment more than my own when it comes to people. You and I built everything together, Lily. Every brick of our company, every dollar in our accounts, every moment of our success. It was us, not me. Us. something I fear our children may forget without my voice to remind them. I made arrangements that may seem unusual, but I did so out of love for you and concern for our legacy. The enclosed documents outline the true ownership structure of Holbrook Industries and our properties. Contrary to what Jason, and perhaps even our children, have led you to believe, control was never transferred to anyone but you. You are, and have always been, the majority shareholder. The board answers to you. The property belongs to you. The decisions are yours to make. I kept this arrangement private because I wanted to see who would respect you without the leverage of legal power. I wanted to know if our children and Jason would honor your wisdom on its own merit. I'm sorry if this test has caused you pain. You deserved better than to be sidelined or dismissed. If that has happened, then the time has come to reclaim what was always rightfully yours. All my love, now and always, David. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. Behind the letter were legal documents, board resolutions, and ownership certificates, all confirming what David had written. I had never lost control of the company. I had never lost ownership of our home. It had all been a test, one that Jason, Amelia, and Caleb had failed spectacularly. Memories flooded back as I sat there, clutching the proof of my husband's foresight and my children's betrayal. I remembered the early days of our marriage, when David and I had started the business from our garage, packaging electronic components by hand, while taking turns rocking Amelia's bassinet with one foot. I remembered the countless nights at the kitchen table, calculating margins and projecting growth, while David marveled at my head for numbers. "You're the real financial genius, Lily," he would say. "I just talk a good game." I remembered how I'd handled the company's books, managed relationships with our first major clients, and negotiated our initial loans, all while raising 2 children and maintaining the home that would eventually become a showcase property. Yet somehow, after David's death, those memories had been rewritten. In the narrative Jason crafted and my children accepted, I was just David's supportive wife, not his business partner, not his equal, certainly not the co-architect of Holbrook Industries' success. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as I carefully returned the documents to the envelope. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, decisions I never thought I'd have to make. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the invisible matriarch who had sat silently at tonight's celebration. She was Lillian Brooks, co-founder of a multi-million-dollar company, the rightful owner of a legacy, and a woman who had been patient long enough. The last thing I did before turning out the lights was send a text message to Howard Whitman, David's attorney and apparently my silent guardian. "I received the envelope. We need to talk tomorrow." His response came immediately. "I've been waiting for this day for 3 years. My office, 9 a.m. I slept soundly that night for the first time since David's funeral. Tomorrow, everything would change. The Scottsdale morning greeted me with brilliant sunshine and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I dressed with purpose, not in the pastel cardigans and sensible slacks that Amelia had gradually filled my closet with, but in a sleek navy suit I'd kept from my active business days. It still fit perfectly. Howard Whitman's law office occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown building. His assistant, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30, looked startled when I gave my name. "Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Whitman is expecting you. Please, go right in." Howard stood as I entered, his familiar bulk and silver hair comforting reminders of a time when I was respected. He'd been David's attorney for nearly 30 years, and one of the few people who'd known us before success transformed our lives. "Lillian," he said warmly, coming around his desk to embrace me. "You look like yourself again." "I feel like myself again," I admitted, taking the seat he offered. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Howard? 3 years of being sidelined, treated like a doddering old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own legacy." Howard's expression sobered. David's instructions were explicit. The envelope was only to be delivered when certain conditions were met. What conditions? When Jason moved forward with development plans for the conservation land. He grimaced. David knew Jason had his eye on that property. He suspected it would be the clearest signal that things had gone too far. I placed the envelope on his desk. "According to these documents, I never lost control of anything." "That's correct." Howard leaned forward. David created a complex ownership structure. On paper, it appeared that control transferred to a trust managed by Jason, with Amelia and Caleb as beneficiaries. But that was essentially a shell. The real controlling interest remained with you through a holding company. But the board meetings, the decisions, the changes to the company, all technically requiring your approval, which was being falsely represented. Howard's tone hardened. Jason has been operating with borrowed authority. In legal terms, Lillian, he's been committing fraud. The weight of this revelation settled over me. My own children allowed this? Howard's expression softened. They were misled too, at least initially. Jason presented documents, forgeries, as it turns out, showing that David had appointed him as the primary decision-maker. By the time anyone might have questioned it, the narrative was established. You were the grieving widow who needed protection from complicated business matters. And I played right into it, I whispered. I was so lost after David died, so willing to believe that maybe he hadn't trusted me with the company after all. Grief makes us vulnerable, Howard said gently. Jason exploited that. But David knew you, Lillian. He knew you'd find your strength again. That's why he arranged for me to watch and wait. I took a deep breath. What happens now? Howard smiled. The kind of smile that reminded me of David when he was about to close an important deal. That depends entirely on what you want to happen. Legally, you, could walk into Halbrook Industries this afternoon, call security, and have Jason removed from the premises. The image was tempting but incomplete. And my children? His expression sobered. That's more complicated. They've been complicit. But they're your children. Only you can decide where to draw that line. For several minutes, I sat in silence, weighing options and examining my own heart. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. I want justice, not vengeance. I want truth, not humiliation. And most importantly, I want to honor what David and I built together. Howard nodded approvingly. Then here's what I suggest. An hour later, I left his office with a clear plan and a renewed sense of purpose. My first stop was the bank, where I accessed the safe deposit box David and I had maintained for decades. Inside was exactly what I'd expected. Additional documentation, photographs, and a small recording device containing conversations that proved my role in the company's founding and growth. Next, I visited Sophie Ramirez, my oldest friend and the one person who had consistently questioned Jason's sudden rise to power. She had worked as our executive assistant for 20 years before being early retired by Jason shortly after David's death. I knew it, Sophie exclaimed when I explained the situation. David would never have handed everything over to that preening peacock. You were always the brains behind the operation, Lillian. Not the only brains, I corrected her, but certainly not the decorative figurehead they've made me out to be. So what's the plan? Sophie asked, her eyes sparkling with the same mischief that had sustained our friendship through decades. I shared the strategy Howard and I had developed. By the time I finished, Sophie was grinning broadly. It's perfect, she declared. Elegant, devastating, and completely fair. When do we start? Tonight, I replied. There's a board dinner at La Fontaine. Jason's presenting the final development plans for approval. A dinner you weren't invited to, I assume. Naturally. I'm just the founder's widow, after all. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. But I think I'll make an appearance anyway. That afternoon, I returned to the guest house and made several discreet phone calls. To board members who had known David and me from the beginning, to our original investors, and to the environmental foundation that had been working with David on the Nature Center plans. As the sun began to set over Scottsdale, I opened my closet and removed a garment bag that had remained untouched since before David's death. Inside was an evening gown he had always loved, a deep emerald silk that he said brought out the fire in my eyes. I'd worn it to our 30th anniversary celebration, the last formal event we'd attended together before his diagnosis. As I dressed, I thought about the woman I'd allowed myself to become after his death. Diminished, uncertain, willing to accept scraps of respect from my own children. That woman was gone now. In her place stood Lillian Brooks, co-founder of Halbrook Industries and rightful guardian of its legacy. My phone chimed with a text from Sophie. Car will pick you up at 7:30. Everything's in place. I replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji, something that would have horrified Amelia, who constantly reminded me that women of a certain age shouldn't use such youthful communication tools. At precisely 7:30, a sleek town car pulled up to the guest house. The driver, an older gentleman with kind eyes, nodded respectfully. Good evening, Mrs. Brooks. I understand we're going to La Fontaine this evening. Yes, I replied, settling into the back seat. I believe they're expecting me, even if they don't know it yet. The drive to downtown Scottsdale was brief. As we approached the restaurant, I could see the private dining terrace where Halbrook events were always held. Through the glass walls, I glimpsed Jason, standing at the head of the table, gesturing expansively as he spoke. My children flanked him like courtiers attending a king. The driver opened my door, and I emerged into the warm Arizona evening. "Good luck, Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly, and I wondered if Howard had briefed him on my mission. "Thank you," I replied. "But tonight isn't about luck. It's about truth." With those words, I walked into the restaurant, head held high, the emerald silk rustling softly with each step. The maitre d' recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Brooks, we weren't expecting you this evening." I smiled serenely. "I know, but I believe there's a seat at that table that rightfully belongs to me." As I approached the private terrace, I could see Jason in full performance mode, digital renderings of Halbrook heights displayed on screens around the room. The board members, mostly newer appointees selected by Jason, were nodding along, cocktails in hand. I paused at the entrance, taking in the scene, the company I had helped build, the legacy I had nurtured, the future that was about to change course dramatically. Amelia noticed me first, her champagne glass freezing halfway to her lips. "Mom?" she said, loud enough to interrupt Jason's presentation. Heads turned. Conversations halted. Jason's smile faltered as he registered my presence, and more specifically, my appearance. Gone was the subdued, accommodating mother-in-law. In her place stood a woman who commanded attention. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent terrace. "I believe you're discussing the future of my company. I thought I should be here for that conversation." "Mom," Caleb recovered first, rising from his seat with a forced smile. "What a surprise. We didn't know you were coming." "Clearly," I replied, stepping fully onto the terrace. Jason's expression had transformed from shock to calculated charm. "Lillian, what a wonderful surprise. We were just reviewing some business matters, nothing that would interest you." "On the contrary," I said, moving toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, David's old seat, which now remained symbolically vacant at company functions. "I find I'm quite interested in how you plan to develop the conservation land my husband and I purchased specifically for environmental preservation." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Board members exchanged glances while my children looked distinctly uneasy. "Perhaps we should discuss this later, Mom," Amelia suggested, her voice tight. "This is a formal board meeting." "I'm aware," I replied, seating myself in David's chair. "And as the majority shareholder of Halbrook Industries, I believe I'm entitled to participate." The effect was immediate. Confusion rippled through the room, followed by whispered conversations and questioning looks. Jason's smile remained fixed, but his eyes had hardened to flint. "There seems to be some confusion," he said smoothly. "While we all respect your connection to the company's history, the ownership structure is quite clear." "Is it?" I interrupted, opening my clutch to remove a slim folder. "Because I have documentation suggesting otherwise." I slid the folder toward the center of the table, where Richard Hamilton, the longest-serving board member and someone who had known David and me from the beginning, reached for it curiously. "These appear to be ownership certificates," Richard said slowly, examining the papers. "And trust documents? I don't understand." Howard Whitman chose that moment to enter the terrace, his timing perfect as always. "Perhaps I can clarify," he said, nodding respectfully to the table. "As the attorney who structured these arrangements at David Brooks' direction." Jason's composure slipped visibly. "Howard, this is a private board meeting. You weren't invited." "I was invited by the majority shareholder," Howard replied calmly, gesturing toward me. "Mrs. Brooks has asked me to explain certain legal realities that seem to have been obscured since her husband's passing." For the next 15 minutes, Howard methodically outlined the true ownership structure of Halbrook Industries. He explained how David had created a deceptive surface appearance while ensuring that actual control remained with me. He detailed how, legally speaking, every major decision made over the past 3 years had technically required my approval that had been falsely represented. As he spoke, I watched the faces around the table transform. The newer board members looked shocked. The veterans who had known us longer seemed less surprised, some even nodding as if confirming long-held suspicions. Jason's face had gone rigid, a muscle twitching in his jaw. My children's reactions hurt the most. Amelia looked betrayed, as if I had somehow deceived her rather than the other way around. Caleb's expression was calculating, already trying to determine how this changed his position. what adjustments he would need to make. When Howard finished, Richard Hamilton cleared his throat. If these documents are authentic, and knowing Howard, I have no reason to doubt that, then we have, been operating under false premises for 3 years. He looked directly at me. Lillian, why haven't you spoken up before now? Because I was grieving, I said simply. Because I wanted to believe my children and son-in-law respected me enough to include me honestly. And because, until recently, I didn't realize how far things had gone. Jason recovered enough to mount a defense. This is preposterous. David clearly intended for me to lead the company. Why else would he have spent his final years grooming me for the position? Did he? I asked quietly. Or did you simply position yourself to create that impression after he could no longer contradict you? Before Jason could respond, I removed the small recording device from my clutch and placed it on the table. My husband was a cautious man, especially when it came to people he didn't fully trust. I pressed play, and David's voice filled the terrace. Jason, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I need to be absolutely clear. The conservation land is not and will never be available for development. Lillian and I purchased it specifically to create a nature center. That decision is final. Jason's recorded voice responded, Of course, David. I completely understand and respect that vision. I stopped the recording. That conversation took place 2 weeks before my husband died. Yet here we are, discussing luxury condominiums on that very land. The silence that followed was deafening. Board members stared at Jason, whose face had drained of color. My children seemed frozen in place, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Finally, Richard Hamilton spoke again. I think we need to adjourn this meeting to assess these revelations properly. If what Mrs. Brooks and Mr. Whitman have presented is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it is, then we have significant governance issues to address. Jason made one last attempt to regain control. This is clearly an emotional response from a grieving widow who doesn't understand modern business necessities. The development plan represents the best interests of the company and its shareholders. I am the primary shareholder, I cut in, my voice level but firm, and I understand business perfectly well. I co-founded this company, negotiated our first major contracts, and managed our finances for decades. The fact that you've convinced everyone to forget that doesn't make it any less true. I turned to address the entire table. I have no intention of disrupting the company's operations unnecessarily. I simply want to reclaim my rightful place in decisions about its future, and to honor my husband's wishes regarding the conservation land. The board meeting broke up shortly after, with shell-shocked members filing out with quiet goodbyes and concerned glances. Howard departed with a supportive squeeze of my shoulder, leaving me alone with my children and Jason. The facade had completely crumbled. Jason's charm had vanished, replaced by cold fury. You had no right, he hissed. Do you have any idea what you've done? Reclaimed what was mine, I replied steadily. What was always mine. Amelia was crying silently, mascara tracking down her perfect cheeks. Mom, how could you ambush us like this? In front of the entire board? The way you've ambushed me for 3 years? Excluding me from decisions? Dismissing my input? Treating me like an inconvenient relic? I shook my head. I gave you every chance to include me respectfully. You chose differently. Caleb, ever the pragmatist, was already adjusting his position. We need to discuss how to move forward. Obviously, if the legal situation is as Howard presented, changes will need to be made. Yes, I agreed, rising from the table. They will, but not tonight. Tonight I'm going home. To the main house, which, as it turns out, I still own. We'll discuss the future tomorrow, when everyone has had time to absorb reality. As I walked away, Jason called after me, his voice laced with venom. This isn't over, Lillian. I turned back, meeting his gaze directly. You're right about that, Jason. It's just beginning. The morning after the board meeting, I awoke in the master bedroom of the main house for the first time in 3 years. The staff had been surprised, but notably not displeased, when I arrived the previous evening and announced I would be staying. Mrs. Vasquez, our housekeeper of 20 years who had been relegated to guest house duty when Jason and Amelia took over, had personally prepared the room with an efficiency that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. The sheets are fresh, Mrs. Brooks, she'd said, a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. I've kept everything just as you like it. I'd slept deeply, wrapped in familiar comfort. Now, as morning light streamed through the windows overlooking the desert landscape, I prepared to face the consequences of my actions. I was under no illusion that Jason would surrender gracefully, or that my children would immediately see the error of their ways. I was right. By 9 o'clock, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages. Amelia was deeply hurt and confused. Caleb wanted to discuss pragmatic solutions. Jason had consulted his own attorneys, who would be addressing these baseless accusations. Board members were requesting private meetings. Local business press had somehow caught wind that something significant had happened at Halbrook Industries. I answered none of them, choosing instead to enjoy a leisurely breakfast on the terrace where David and I had shared so many mornings. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I heard the front door slam open and Amelia's voice echoing through the house. "Mom? Mom! Where are you?" "On the terrace," I called calmly, not moving from my seat. She appeared moments later, immaculately dressed despite her obvious distress. At 36, my daughter was truly beautiful, though the years of privileged living had hardened something in her eyes that had once been soft. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, gesturing around at the house. "Having breakfast," I replied, taking another sip of coffee. "Would you like some? Mrs. Vasquez makes excellent croissants." "You know what I mean. This is our house now." I set down my cup carefully. "Actually, Amelia, it isn't. It never was. The property remains in my name, as Howard explained last night." Her perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she gripped the back of a chair. "You can't just waltz back in and take over everything. Jason and I have made a life here. A life built on false premises," I pointed out, "on decisions and authorities that were never rightfully yours. Dad wanted Jason to lead the company. He was grooming him. Your father tolerated Jason. He never trusted him with his legacy." I softened my tone. "Amelia, sit down, please." After a moment's hesitation, she sank into the chair, her defenses visibly weakening. "I don't understand any of this. Why would Dad set things up this way? Why would he deliberately mislead us? He didn't mislead you. He created a test, one that would reveal people's true characters once. He was gone." I reached across the table to touch her hand. "He wanted to know if you, Caleb, and Jason would respect me and his wishes without the force of legal obligation. He wanted to see if power would corrupt or elevate you." Her eyes filled with tears. "And we failed." "Yes," I said gently. "You did." For several minutes, we sat in silence, the weight of 3 years of subtle slights and growing disrespect hanging between us. Finally, Amelia spoke again, her voice smaller. "What happens now? That depends partly on you and Caleb, and on how Jason responds." I met her gaze directly. "The conservation land will not be developed. That decision is non-negotiable. As for the rest, the company leadership, this house, our family relationships, those things can be negotiated, but only on the basis of truth and mutual respect." "Jason won't accept this," she whispered. "He's already talking about lawsuits challenging the documents." "I know, and that's a choice he can make." I kept my voice level. "But he will lose, Amelia. The documentation is extensive and ironclad. David made very sure of that." She brushed away a tear. "I don't know what to do. Jason's my husband. You're my mother. I'm caught in the middle." "No," I corrected her. "You're caught between truth and convenience, between integrity and advantage. That's not the middle. That's a choice." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Caleb, looking harried but composed. Always the pragmatist, my son had clearly decided to adapt rather than resist. He kissed my cheek with a warmth I hadn't felt from him in years. "Mom, you've certainly shaken things up." "Someone needed to," I replied, gesturing for him to join us. As Caleb sat down, I noticed how he positioned himself, not beside Amelia, but midway between us. "Always calculating angles, my son." "I've been on the phone with Richard Hamilton and 2 other board members," he said, accepting the coffee Mrs. Vasquez appeared to serve. "They've verified everything with their own attorneys. The legal situation is unambiguous. You control the company." Amelia looked stricken. "So it's true? All of it?" "Every word," Caleb confirmed. "Dad set up a masterful structure. On the surface, it appeared control had transferred to Jason through the family trust. In reality, Mom retained majority voting rights through a separate holding company." He turned to me with newfound respect. "It was brilliant, actually. A perfect trap for anyone who might try to seize control improperly." "Your father was always careful with what mattered to him," I said. The conversation shifted then to practicalities. Caleb, ever the businessman, wanted to discuss transition plans, board restructuring, and how to handle the press. Amelia mostly listened, occasionally wiping away tears. I outlined my initial thoughts. I would resume an active role as board chair. The conservation project would proceed as David had intended, and the company's direction would be reevaluated with input from long-standing board members who understood our original vision. And Jason? Caleb asked the question we'd all been avoiding. That depends on him, I replied. Honestly. If he can accept the new reality and work within appropriate boundaries, there may still be a place for him. If not, the sound of tires on gravel interrupted us. Moments later, Jason burst onto the terrace, his normally perfect appearance disheveled, his eyes wild with barely contained fury. Family meeting without me, he sneered, glaring at each of us in turn. How cozy. Jason. Amelia stood, reaching for him. Please, let's just talk. He shook off her hand. There's nothing to talk about. Your mother has made her position clear. Now I'm making mine clear. He turned to face me directly. I've built this company into what it is today. I've doubled revenue, expanded market share, created opportunities none of you could have managed. And this is my thanks? Being ambushed. And humiliated? You were given opportunities most people would be grateful for, I replied calmly. A generous salary, significant authority, the chance to contribute to a successful company. What you weren't given was the right to erase me from my own life's work or to disregard my husband's explicit wishes. Jason's laugh was bitter. Always the victim, aren't you, Lillian? Poor, overlooked mother-in-law, pushed aside by the big bad son-in-law. Did it ever occur to you that maybe David didn't trust you with the company because you weren't capable of running it? Amelia gasped. Jason, that's enough. But he was beyond restraint now. Years of carefully maintained facade crumbling away. 3 years. I've smiled and nodded at your outdated ideas. 3 years. I've pretended your input mattered while building something bigger than you or David ever dreamed possible. And now you want to throw away a $200 million development opportunity for some ridiculous nature preserve? This company deserves better. It deserves vision, not nostalgia. I remained seated, watching him unravel. When he finally paused for breath, I spoke quietly. Are you finished? Not even close, he spat. My attorneys will contest every document. We'll challenge the entire structure. By the time I'm done, you'll have spent a fortune in legal fees to confirm what is already evident, I interrupted. And you'll have destroyed any chance of maintaining a position at Hallbrook Industries. I stood then, squaring my shoulders. Let me be perfectly clear, Jason. You can accept the new reality with grace and continue to contribute within appropriate boundaries. Or you can fight a battle you cannot win and lose everything, including, possibly, your marriage. Those are your only options. For a moment, I thought he might actually lunge at me, his face contorted with rage, fists clenching at his sides. Then, just as quickly, the businessman in him reasserted control, his expression smoothed into something calculatedly neutral. This discussion isn't over, he said tightly. Amelia, we're leaving. My daughter looked torn, her eyes darting between her husband and me. I could see the moment she made her choice, a small deflation of her shoulders, a slight downward turn of her mouth. I'll be along shortly, she said softly. I need to talk to Mom a bit longer. Jason's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed dangerously. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, each footstep a promise of retribution. When he was gone, Amelia sank back into her chair, looking exhausted. I've never seen him like that. You have, I corrected gently. You just haven't allowed yourself to see it. Caleb, who had remained silent throughout Jason's tirade, finally spoke. He'll cause problems. He knows too much about our operations, our clients, our strategies. Yes, I agreed. He will, but we'll weather it. I looked at both my children, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The question is, where do you two stand? With him or with the truth? The following week passed in a blur of meetings, legal consultations, and difficult conversations. Jason had, indeed, launched his threatened legal challenge, filing motions to contest the ownership documents and claiming he had been fraudulently excluded from his rightful position. Howard assured me the efforts were futile, like trying to punch through a brick wall with bare knuckles. But they created the expected turmoil within the company and our family. Amelia had moved into one of the guest rooms in the main house, caught between loyalty to her husband and the dawning recognition of his true character. Caleb had pragmatically aligned himself with me, though I harbored no illusions about his motivations. He saw which way the wind was blowing and adjusted his sails accordingly. On Friday morning, I called a special board meeting. The boardroom at Halbrook Industries headquarters felt different. As I entered, the atmosphere charged with anticipation rather than the polite dismissal I'd grown accustomed to during my occasional appearances over the past 3 years. Richard Hamilton rose to greet me, pulling out the chair at the head of the table. David's chair, which had become Jason's by silent agreement after my husband's death. "Welcome back, Lillian," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. As the meeting began, I looked around at the assembled faces. Most of the board members were present, save for 2 of Jason's most recent appointees who had resigned upon learning the truth. Caleb sat to my right, briefcase open and notes meticulously arranged. Amelia had chosen to attend as well, sitting quietly at the far end, her expression guarded. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know the past week has been challenging and confusing for many of you. Today, I want to provide clarity about Halbrook Industries' path forward. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined my vision. Not a revolutionary departure from the company's core values, but a return to them. We would honor David's commitment to the conservation project, redirecting resources from Jason's luxury development. We would refocus on the ethical business practices and community involvement that had been the foundation of our success. Some of you may wonder why David structured things this way," I said, addressing the question I knew was on everyone's mind. "Why create this test? Why not simply make his wishes explicitly clear?" I paused, my fingers brushing over the wedding ring I still wore. David believed that character reveals itself most truthfully when people believe no one is watching, or when they believe they can act without consequence. He wanted to know how our family, particularly the next generation of leadership, would behave when they thought power had shifted entirely to them. My eyes found Amelia, who was staring down at her hands. Caleb's pen had stopped its constant movement across his notepad. "The results were educational," I continued, "and painful. But they've given us an opportunity to rebuild on truth rather than illusion." As the meeting progressed to specific business matters, I noticed a subtle shift in the room. Board members who had previously directed their comments and questions to Caleb or absent male executives now addressed me directly. Ideas were presented for my consideration rather than simply announced as decisions. My input was sought rather than tolerated. By the meeting's end, a new order had clearly established itself. There would be challenges ahead: Jason's legal maneuvers, potential client uncertainty, staff adjustments, but the foundation was sound. I closed the session with a simple statement. Halbrook Industries was built on partnership, integrity, and vision. Those values haven't changed. Neither has our commitment to them. As people filed out, Amelia approached hesitantly. "Mom, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to talk privately." We retreated to David's old office, my office now, with its sweeping views of the Scottsdale landscape. Amelia perched on the edge of a leather chair, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had in years. "I've filed for separation," she said without preamble. "From Jason." I kept my expression neutral, though my heart ached for her. "I'm sorry it's come to that." "Are you?" She looked up, searching my face. "You never liked him." "I wanted to," I replied honestly. "For your sake. But no, I never trusted him. Neither did your father." She nodded slowly. "I see that. Now, the way he spoke to you on the terrace. That wasn't new, was it? That's who he's always been when no one else was watching." "Yes." Tears filled her eyes. "Why didn't I see it? How could I have been so blind?" I moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. "Because you wanted to believe in the life he was offering. The status, the admiration, the sense of being chosen by someone everyone else envied." I squeezed her fingers gently. "There's no shame in wanting to be valued, Amelia. The mistake was in where you looked for that validation." She leaned against me then, in a way she hadn't since childhood. "I've made such a mess of everything. The way I treated you after Dad died, dismissing your input, treating you like you were just an old lady?" I supplied, with the ghost of a smile. "Past my prime and usefulness?" She winced. "Yes, that. It was cruel and disrespectful, and I'm so sorry, Mom." "I know," I said softly, "and I forgive you. But rebuilding trust will take time. And actions, not just words." We talked for nearly an hour, peeling back layers of misunderstanding and hurt that had accumulated between us. Amelia shared how Jason had subtly positioned himself as the authority on business matters, gradually creating distance between her and me by emphasizing generational differences and suggesting I was struggling with cognitive decline. He'd say things like, "Your mother seems confused lately, have you noticed?" Or, It's tough watching parents age, isn't it? She admitted. Until I started seeing you through his lens, rather than my own eyes. A common manipulation tactic, I observed, isolate someone from their support system by undermining trust. As our conversation wound down, Amelia asked the question that clearly weighed most heavily on her mind. Can I fix this, Mom? Can we ever get back to where we were? I considered her question carefully. We can't go backward, Amelia. Too much has happened, but we can build something new. Something more honest, perhaps, than what we had before. She nodded, wiping away tears. I'd like that. I really would. As she rose to leave, I added, one more thing. The Nature Center project. Your father's dream for the conservation land will need a director. Someone with genuine passion for environmental education and community outreach. I met her gaze steadily. The position is yours if you want it. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a tentative hope. But I don't have experience in... You have a master's degree in environmental science that you set aside to support Jason's career, I reminded her. You volunteered at conservation organizations throughout college, and most importantly, you need a purpose that's truly your own, not defined by your husband. Or your family name. For the first time in our conversation, Amelia smiled genuinely. I'd like to think about it. Take all the time you need, I replied. The land isn't going anywhere. After she left, I sat alone in the office that had been David's, running my fingers over the desk where we'd made so many decisions together. I could almost feel his presence, his approval. We're finding our way back, I whispered to the empty room. It won't be easy, but we're trying. The intercom buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. My newly reinstated assistant's voice came through clearly. Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Hamilton is here. He says it's important. Moments later, Richard entered, holding a thick folder and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. We've found something, Lillian. Something that changes everything with Jason's legal challenge. What is it? I asked, gesturing for him to sit. Financial discrepancies. Significant ones. He opened the folder, spreading documents across the desk. Once we started really looking at the deals Jason was making, patterns emerged. Consulting fees to shell companies, inflated contract values with kickbacks, and most significantly, evidence that he was already diverting company resources toward personal projects. I examined the papers, a cold certainty settling in my stomach. He was stealing from us. Methodically and extensively, Richard confirmed. The development project for the conservation land? He'd already established a separate LLC that would have owned 40% of the venture, despite using Halbrook Industries' capital for the entire investment. The revelation should have shocked me, but somehow it didn't. It merely confirmed what I'd sensed about Jason from the beginning. His charm concealed a fundamentally self-serving nature. What do you recommend? I asked Richard. He leaned forward intently. We have two options. We can use this as leverage to force a quick settlement of his legal challenges. Essentially, drop the lawsuits or face potential criminal charges. Or we can pursue this regardless. Make a clean break. Let the consequences fall where they may. I thought of Amelia, already wounded by her husband's betrayal, of the company's reputation, of the employees who depended on stability. Let me think about it, I said finally. This affects more than just the business. As Richard left, I moved to the window, gazing out at the desert landscape stretching toward the mountains. The decisions ahead were complex, balancing justice with mercy, business with family, past with future. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt fully capable of making them. Not as David's widow or as the overlooked matriarch, but as Lillian Brooks, a woman reclaiming her rightful place and power. The path forward wouldn't be simple, but it would be mine to choose. 2 months after the boardroom revelation, Halbrook Industries had stabilized into a new normal. The initial shock had given way to acceptance, then to cautious optimism as our employees and partners adjusted to my leadership. Richard Hamilton had proven invaluable during the transition, lending his considerable reputation to reassure nervous clients and investors. Jason's legal challenges had collapsed spectacularly once our financial investigation findings were presented to his attorneys. Faced with the choice between a quiet settlement or potential criminal charges, he had grudgingly accepted a separation agreement that allowed him to retain certain assets but required his complete disassociation from Halbrook Industries and a strict non-disclosure agreement. The divorce proceedings with Amelia were proceeding with similar pragmatism. Jason seemed more concerned with salvaging what wealth he could than fighting over emotional matters. On this particular morning, I arrived at the office early to prepare for what would be a landmark day for both our company and our family. The Shy Conservation Education Center, now officially named the David Brooks Nature Preserve, would break ground at a ceremony scheduled for noon. After 3 years of being sidelined, after decades of being underestimated, I would stand before the community and honor my husband's vision in exactly the way he had intended. My new office, redesigned to reflect my own taste rather than preserved as a shrine to David, felt comfortable and energizing. Gone were the heavy mahogany furnishings and dark leather that had dominated the space during his tenure. In their place were lighter woods, touches of desert-inspired color, and large windows that I'd had installed to maximize natural light. David's presence remained in carefully chosen photographs and meaningful mementos, but the space now spoke of both our legacies, not just his. A knock at the door interrupted my review of the day's schedule. Caleb entered, impeccably dressed as always, though I noted subtle changes in his appearance. The ostentatious watch and designer accessories that had once been his uniform had been replaced by more understated choices. His expression, too, had softened from the calculating mask he'd worn during Jason's reign. "Good morning, Mom," he said, setting a coffee on my desk, prepared exactly as I liked it, a small gesture of attention he'd begun recently. "Ready for the big day?" "Almost," I replied, accepting the coffee with a smile. "Just reviewing my remarks for the ceremony." Caleb settled into a chair, his posture less rigid than I remembered. "I wanted to talk to you about something before we head out." "There." "Of course." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few months. About Dad, about the company, about the way I've conducted myself." He met my gaze directly. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not just the diplomatic adjustments I've been making to accommodate the new power structure." I set down my pen, giving him my full attention. "I'm listening." "I lost sight of what mattered," he admitted. "Somewhere along the way, I started valuing the appearance of success over the substance of it. I let Jason's influence shape my perspective because it seemed expedient." He shook his head. "I treated you dismissively. I forgot, or chose to ignore, everything you and Dad built together." The honesty in his voice touched me deeply. Unlike Amelia's emotional reconciliation, Caleb's approach was measured and deliberate, but no less sincere for its thoughtfulness. "What changed?" I asked. He considered the question. "Watching you these past 2 months. You've led with such clarity. No grandstanding, no power plays, just clear vision and purpose. It reminded me of how you and Dad ran things before we all got caught up in Jason's version of success." I nodded, acknowledging both the compliment and the implicit criticism of how things had drifted. "The company lost its way a bit. We all did. I want to find mine again," Caleb said quietly. "I've been talking with the team developing the educational programming for the Nature Preserve. There's an opportunity to create financial literacy courses for underserved communities as part of the center's mission. I'd like to lead that initiative, if you'll trust me with it." The request surprised me. Caleb had always been focused on corporate finance and investment strategy, the big money aspects of our business. Community education seemed a profound shift. "Why this particular project?" I asked, genuinely curious. A flicker of vulnerability crossed his face. "Dad used to say that wealth without purpose is just numbers on a page. I think I forgot that for a while." He straightened slightly. "Also, practically speaking, I need to rebuild some things. My reputation, your trust, my own sense of doing something worthwhile." I studied my son, seeing glimpses of both the ambitious young man he'd become and the thoughtful boy he'd once been. "I think it's an excellent idea. And yes, I trust you with it, with the understanding that you'll be working closely with Amelia as the center's director." He nodded, accepting this condition without the resistance I might have expected months earlier. "I've already spoken with her about it. We're finding better ways to communicate, without Jason between us." As he rose to leave, I added, "Caleb, I'm proud of you for this. Genuinely proud." A smile, unguarded and reminiscent of his younger self, briefly transformed his face. "That means more than you know, Mom." After he left, I turned back to my notes for the groundbreaking ceremony, adding a few lines about legacy and renewal. The family healing that had begun was still fragile, still finding its footing, but it felt authentic in a way our relationships hadn't been for years. At 11:30, my assistant reminded me it was time to depart for the conservation land. As I gathered my things, Sophie Ramirez, now reinstated as our executive communications director, appeared in my doorway. "Car's ready, Lillian," she announced. "And you should know, The turnout is massive. Local press, environmental groups, community leaders, half the key business community. Word got out that this is more than just another corporate project. I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. Is it too much, Sophie? Am I doing this for the right reasons? My oldest friend studied me with the frankness that had sustained our relationship for decades. You're honoring David's vision, creating something meaningful for the community, and reclaiming your own voice in the process. I'd say those are pretty solid reasons. She was right, of course. As we drove to the site, I gazed out at the Scottsdale landscape, the desert beauty that had captivated David and me when we first moved here as young entrepreneurs with big dreams and limited resources. The conservation land came into view, 30 acres of pristine desert ecosystem that would now be permanently protected from development. A large tent had been erected for the ceremony, with rows of chairs already filling with attendees. Near the podium stood Amelia, confidently directing the final arrangements. The past 2 months had transformed her as well. The separation from Jason had been painful but clarifying, allowing her to rediscover her own passions and strengths. As director of the Nature Center project, she had thrown herself into the work with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in her for years. She spotted our car and hurried over as I emerged, her face alight with excitement rather than the anxious desire to please that had characterized her interactions with Jason. "Mom, wait until you see the architectural models," she said, taking my arm. "They've incorporated every element of Dad's original vision, but with these amazing sustainable features that will make the center almost completely self-sufficient." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling genuinely as she guided me through the growing crowd. Board members nodded respectfully as we passed. Former colleagues who had been pushed out during Jason's tenure had returned for the occasion. Even Mrs. Vasquez was there, beaming proudly from the front row, where I'd made sure she had a reserved seat. As noon approached, I took my place at the podium, surveying the gathered community. The microphone felt solid in my hands, a physical reminder that my voice mattered again, that it had always mattered. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Today, we break ground not just on a building, but on a promise to honor our natural world, to educate future generations, and to create a legacy of stewardship that will outlast all of us." As I spoke about David's vision for the land, about our shared commitment to giving back to the community that had supported our success, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what we had worked for all those years. Not just business success or personal wealth, but the ability to make a meaningful difference. "Some of you may know that this project almost took a very different direction," I acknowledged, my gaze briefly finding the few remaining board members who had supported Jason's development plans. "But today represents a recommitment to our core values, to choosing purpose over profit when necessary, to honoring promises even when more lucrative options present themselves." I gestured to where Amelia and Caleb stood side by side. The Brooks family and Hallbrook Industries are entering a new chapter, one that builds on our past while creating something meaningful for the future. As ceremonial shovels were distributed for the groundbreaking photo opportunity, I felt a presence beside me. Not physical, but a spiritual sense that David was there, witnessing this moment. I could almost hear his voice. "You did it, Lily. You held on to what matters." With cameras flashing and applause rising from the crowd, I pushed my shovel into the earth, the first symbolic step in building something that would outlast all the boardroom battles and family struggles. Something true. Later, as the formal ceremony transitioned into a celebratory reception, Richard Hamilton approached me with 2 glasses of champagne. "To David," he said, handing me one, "and to you, Lillian, for reminding us all what this company was supposed to be about." I accepted the glass with a nod. "To remembering who we are, even when others forget." As afternoon sunlight bathed the desert landscape in golden hues, I watched my children mingling with guests, explaining features of the planned center with genuine enthusiasm. They were finding their way back, not to who they had been before, but to something new and potentially better. We all were. The path forward remained complex. The company still faced challenges. My relationship with my children was healing but fragile, yet standing there, on land that had been saved. From concrete and steel, I felt a deep certainty that we were moving in the right direction, not just as a business, but as a family. Some battles are fought with legal documents and boardroom maneuvers, but the most important victories are measured in reclaimed dignity, in renewed purpose, in the courage to stand for what matters. even when, especially when, others tell you that you no longer matter yourself. 1 year later, I stood in the entrance hall of the newly completed David Brooks Nature Preserve, watching as final preparations were made for the grand opening celebration. Sunlight streamed through the building's innovative design, a blend of modern architecture and natural materials that seemed to emerge organically from the desert landscape. The center was everything David had envisioned and more. Educational classrooms with cutting-edge technology, interactive exhibits about desert ecology, community spaces for workshops and events, a financial literacy center led by Caleb that had already begun outreach programs in underserved neighborhoods. And at its heart, a central courtyard featuring a serene reflection pool where a simple plaque read, "In honor of David Brooks, who saw the true value of this land." "What do you think, Mom?" Amelia appeared beside me, clipboard in hand and pride evident in her voice. "Does it live up to Dad's vision?" "It exceeds it," I replied honestly. "He would be amazed by what you've accomplished here." Over the past year, the nature preserve had become Amelia's passion and redemption. Freed from Jason's influence and reconnected to her own values, she had thrown herself into the project with remarkable dedication. Her divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and while the process had been painful, she had emerged stronger, more certain of herself and her priorities. "The governor just arrived," she informed me, checking her watch. "We should head to the courtyard for the opening ceremony." As we walked through the building, staff members and volunteers nodded respectfully. Many were new, hired specifically for the center, but others were longtime Halbrook employees who had chosen to transfer to the project, people who remembered the company's original values and were gratified to see them restored. The courtyard was filled with guests, political figures, community leaders, environmental advocates, and many of the workers who had built the center. At the front stood a small stage with chairs for the key participants in today's ceremony. Caleb was already there, deep in conversation with the superintendent of schools about expanding the center's educational programs. I took my seat as the ceremony began, watching with quiet satisfaction as speakers praised the center's mission and design. When it was Amelia's turn to speak, I felt a surge of maternal pride. Gone was the uncertain woman who had sought validation through her husband's accomplishments. In her place stood a confident leader articulating a clear vision for the center's future. "This preserve represents more than conservation," she told the crowd. "It represents recognition that true legacy isn't measured in property, values, or development profits. It's measured in what we preserve, protect, and pass on to future generations." As Amelia introduced Caleb to speak about the financial education initiatives, I glanced at the audience and noticed a familiar face in the back row, Jason, looking slightly older and considerably less polished than he had during his days as Halbrook's self-proclaimed heir. Our eyes met, briefly across the crowd. He gave a small, tight nod before turning to leave. I hadn't expected him to attend, and his presence stirred complicated feelings. According to what I'd heard through business channels, he had launched a small development company of his own after our settlement, with modest success, but none of the meteoric rise he had once envisioned for himself. The experience of losing everything he had thought was his had apparently taught him some measure of humility, or at least caution. Caleb concluded his remarks, and then it was my turn to speak. As I approached the podium, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not an ending, but the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. When my late husband David purchased this land 25 years ago, many people questioned his decision, I began. It wasn't prime real estate at the time. It didn't offer obvious development potential. But David saw something others missed, the inherent value of preservation in a world too focused on development. I paused, looking out at the assembled community. What you may not know is that 3 years ago, this preserve almost didn't happen. After David's passing, there were those who saw only the land's commercial value, who pushed for luxury condominiums instead of education and conservation. A murmur passed through the crowd. While the general public knew there had been leadership changes at Halbrook Industries, the full story of our family struggle had remained private. I share this not to revisit old conflicts, but to highlight an important truth. Sometimes the most valuable thing we can do is simply say no. No to short-term profit over long-term vision. No to expedience over principle. No to allowing ourselves to be silenced when we know what's right. My eyes found Amelia and Caleb in the front row, both watching me intently. This center exists because of many people's efforts, but at its foundation is a simple act of recognition. The Recognition that some legacies aren't measured in dollars. Some voices deserve to be heard even when others try to dismiss them as outdated or irrelevant. I gestured to the building around us. The David Brooks Nature Preserve will educate thousands of children, protect a precious ecosystem, and serve as a community resource for generations to come. But I hope it also stands as a reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, to stand for what matters, to insist on being seen and heard. As I concluded my remarks and rejoined my children for the ribbon cutting, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for years. The path to this moment had been painful and challenging, but necessary, not just for the preserve, but for our family's healing. After the formal ceremony, as the guests explored the new facilities, Sophie found me near the desert garden exhibit. "Quite a difference from that board dinner a year ago," she observed with a knowing smile. "When you walked in and turned everything upside down." I laughed softly. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "You know," Sophie said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about writing a book. Women of a certain age, reclaiming power in the second half of life. Your story would make a powerful opening chapter." "Only if you change the names to protect the not-so-innocent," I replied. "Some aspects of family drama are better kept private." As afternoon turned to evening, the celebration continued with a gala dinner under the stars. Board members, community partners, and family friends gathered to toast the center's completion. Richard Hamilton, now semi-retired but still a valued advisor, raised his glass in a final toast. To David's vision, Lillian's persistence, and a legacy that will benefit this community for generations to come. Later, as the event wound down, I found myself alone in the courtyard, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple. Amelia and Caleb joined me, one on each side, and for a moment we stood in companionable silence, a family reconnected, if not completely healed. "I was thinking about something Dad used to say," Caleb said finally. "The true measure of success isn't what you build, but what you leave behind." Amelia nodded. "I didn't really understand that until recently. I was so caught up in appearances, in Jason's vision of success, in what other people thought." "We all were, in different ways," I acknowledged. "Even your father and I sometimes lost sight of what really mattered in the pursuit of building the company." "But you found your way back," Amelia said, squeezing my hand. "You showed us how to find our way back, too." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the desert, I reflected on the journey of the past year. From invisibility to recognition, from dismissal to respect, from silence to voice. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear, but it had been profound. For me, for my children, for the company David and I had built together. The Nature Preserve stood as a physical manifestation of that transformation, a testament to persistence, to vision, to the power of quietly standing one's ground even when others insist you no longer matter. 3 years ago, I had sat in a grand ballroom, trembling and invisible, watching as others claimed credit for my life's work. Tonight, I stood firmly grounded in my own authority, surrounded by the tangible results of reclaiming my voice and purpose. "The conservation land was always meant to be David's legacy to this community," I said, softly. "But I think he'd be pleased to know it became something else as well. A catalyst for our family finding its way back to what matters." As we walked together toward the exit, past exhibits that would educate and inspire for decades to come, I thought about all the women who find themselves gradually erased from their own stories, rendered invisible by age, by others' ambitions, by societal expectations that they quietly step aside. My journey had taught me perhaps the most important lesson of my life. True strength isn't always loud or forceful. Sometimes it's the quiet persistence of knowing your worth even when others forget it. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear. The night air was cool and sweet as we stepped outside. Above us, the desert sky blazed with stars. Constant, enduring, impossible to diminish. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with possibility and gratitude. "Ready to go home?" Amelia asked. I nodded, thinking of the main house that was truly mine again, not as David's widow or as the children's mother, but as Lillian Brooks, a woman who had reclaimed every part of her life that others had tried to take away. "Yes," I replied, my voice strong and certain. "I'm ready."